thank you all for being able to join us at this podcast. My name is Tim Swope. We have also with us Eric Papil. I think I mentioned I've stated that correctly.
You did.
Oh, great. And today we're going to talk about data security posture management. Since the last 2 years, that's been something on every IT security manager's mind. And we're going to dig into it and see what the advantages of that are for healthcare, how it relates to changes in the HIPAA and HITECH Acts, and some of the ways that we can utilize that in proactive risk management, understanding that we really can't protect that which we cannot see. So it gives us a good view of our organization, and then how we can leverage that into some of the things that we're also doing today.
Yeah, so hey, my name's Eric Popiel. Actually been at my current company for about 20 years now in the data management and data security space. Spent a lot of time in the ERP space as well, the CRM space before that, and actually started off my career in IT as a COBOL programmer. So unfortunately, I do go that far back in the days. So
Eric and I were friends on MySpace.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. There you go. So data security posture management, that's a term that Gartner kind of brought around, call it about a year and a half ago or so at their RSA conference, right? And so when you look at that, it's really an emergence of data security as a discipline, but primarily about, I think a lot about data privacy regulations and legislation. And so, when you look at data security posture management, it provides that visibility where security is, who has access to the data, how is it being used, what's the security posture that they stored in or the application is doing, and how we assess that by identifying and classifying the potential risk and vulnerabilities against it and implementing those security tools across this. And kind of one other thing, right? It's all about, in my mind, creating another term that seems to be thrown around a lot here recently, which is data trust, which is, why do we have data? How do we, how did we get that data? How do we collect that data? How long are we keeping that data? Is the data complete? Is it unaltered? Where is it being used? Is it destroyed at some point in time as well, in accordance to various policies and procedures? And all of those things, make up this concept of data trust. Does that make sense, Tim?
Yeah. Yeah. And, Eric, I had a good question for you. It's, you and I have been in this game for a long time.
Yeah.
And do you feel that data security posture management came out of regulations, compliance, or it came out of our ability to not be able to see certain things within our environment? In other words, to understand really all the assets that we have. One of the things an update to the HIPAA rules is an annual review of your asset inventory. Now, that's just one piece of it because it gives you an idea of some visibility. But do you feel it came out of regulations, or do you really feel that it's moving faster than the regulations because security professionals understand that we need some more visibility?
Actually, great point, Tim. So I do think a good portion of it is coming out of regulations, but also pieces of it are coming out of other concepts as well, as you mentioned, visibility, for example, right? And the one thing that's interesting today is it seems like regulations are pretty much everywhere, right? I mean,
we're in the most regulated industry in healthcare, so yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, healthcare is definitely the most regulated. And when you look at the recent changes to HIPAA and HITECH, right? One of the things that we see out there is, I guess, one of the big problems with HIPAA that a lot of people had is it talked about thou shall do some things and you should do these things. And, it wasn't really strong language. And I think that's been one of the points for a while is, when you look at companies and how they respond to that, if it's simply I shall, they take it as that and say, well, we'll do X amount of things along the way, but maybe not actually solve the root cause of the problem, right? So recent changes to HIPAA HITECH, for example, there's much stronger language around that that are now saying you have to do these things per the various regulations and so on. And of course, you've got SEC, DORA, NIS2 out there, GDPR, CCPA, and when you look a lot of these regulations, certainly here in the U.S., it's not as strong yet, but certainly several European geographies, Turkey, for example, IT executives can go to jail for not handling information properly.
Well,
And
the
even
solar
here in the
winds,
U.S.,
the whole solar winds, their CISO and CIO had a bout with indictments. So uh,
yeah.
it is coming. I think there is personal liability on people in California. It's coming to New York, my area. So
Well, I mean, look at it this way, right? Currently here in the US, right, there are 13 privacy laws in effect now. There'll be about 16 or so by the end of 2025. And and it's just growing and growing and growing around, things like health data, children's data, biometric data,
they're adding in
and so on.
behavioral health and prenatal data now too.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's the trick though, Tim, right? We're seeing a lot of uptick in enforcement actions, right? Both from a regulatory perspective, but also private litigation perspective. For example, right? You take the Texas Data Privacy and Security Act, TDPSA, which was just implemented late last year, and the Scope Act as well. They're already lodging enforcement actions. And even one here recently is January. Texas's attorney, which is my home state, by the way, Ken Paxton filed a lawsuit enforcing the TDPSA, and they have a dedicated privacy enforcement team, right? And so when you look at this, all the other states are starting to fall in line now.
Yeah, and
Washington with
healthcare being
My
a
Health, My Data Act, right?
exactly, former CISO at two very large health systems. The enforcement from OCR is one thing, the class action lawsuits from the patients are the other. I thought I'd bring out too, kind of you were talking about the requirements under HIPAA. There's an irony because you have the required or addressable. So certain things in HIPAA now you have to be HIPAA compliant, but many things in there are addressable or guidance where on a high trust side, you have to have everything in order to get certified, but it's not mandated that you have it. So it's a very interesting. So it looks like HIPAA is getting to the point where they're mandating these controls rather than having a mandated compliance for some things that can just be addressable or suggested to have. So I think
Yeah, and
it's
and
moving in a good way. If you're going to
yeah,
mandate something,
yeah, and also the other thing too, right? As I think I mentioned earlier, if not, it's the enforcement around that and is very aggressive. So it's not like there's when they make the changes here, it's not like you say, oh, I've got 2 years to figure this out. It's a very aggressive timeline for you actually have to comply, or they have the ability to enforce.
yeah, one of the biggest changes too, and this is really part of data security posture management in a way, is having a risk management program. Understanding the risk is understanding your data security posture
Yeah.
and having an ability to remediate them. And that's now a key tenet of the new HIPAA requirements. And not just annual risk assessments, but an active risk management program where it is projected by the HIPAA journal memo that came out in January that 90% of their financial penalties will be based on not meeting those risk management framework and program requirements. So maybe we could talk about how that works in with other industries, but how that's specific to healthcare when it relates to data security posture management.
Yeah, it's a great point, but
A
maybe you
lot of that is
can.
evidence based, so it's got to have when you now rather than saying you've implemented these policies and procedures, it is evidence based on the actual implementation. So that's one of those things. That's concrete in data security posture management and how some of these vendors are helping their clients comply.
Yeah, that's a great point. I want to take just a moment before I answer that, right? And let's talk about that. Is, healthcare is one of the most targeted industries for data breaches, right? And when we talk about a lot of data breaches out there, there are obviously statistics about how much how much it costs per breach, how much, how to remediate, and all these types of statistics that are out there, right? And even though healthcare seemed to have a bit of a decline in the number of data breaches, the actual records breached was an overall, I believe it was around 190 million individuals affected, right? And when you look at healthcare, 14 years in a row, it's been the most expensive industry out there to do that.
Sadly, I would hate to see statistics on the fact that they're running out of new data to steal, but uh,
Yeah, that is that's a great point, right? So when you look at a lot of those things, when you look at non-compliance, how much that costs, how much it costs to market and reestablish brand confidence, and all those types of things for hospitals and
I
so
think
on.
brand confidence and
Yeah, they spend a ton more money
yeah,
than some of the other industries. So there are all those things. So kind of back to your original question, right? And why this is important, not only to healthcare, but in general, right? Um, Again, when you look at, you have to know what you don't know. It's a fact of life now. You go back several years, you could make an argument that, it costs too much to deal with data, or could take too much time. And you would have some of those things that, you could go to a court of law and say, hey, this is too difficult to do, so we want to pass. And you can kind of get one. It's just not that way anymore, because of the underlying regulations of HIPAA, or some of these privacy regulations. It's not, you have to know, right? So and when I talk to a lot of senior executives, right, and I ask them point blank, hey, do you know where your sensitive data is? And I would say 9 times out of 10, it's yes, I absolutely do know, Tim, and or Eric, and then when you kind of dig down a little bit, they say, yeah, it's in their CRM system, or their ERP system, or their billing system, right? Those are the obvious places where they are. The question then becomes is, well, what about all the upstream applications, the downstream applications, the analytical environments, the what you're sharing with third parties, what you're pumping into AI models, well, the corner IT organizations and the departmental applications. Do you really, really, really know where all your sensitive data is? And that's, to your point, that's where this data discovery capability is extremely helpful. That can go across the entire landscape of your portfolio of applications and data, as well as the associated risk assessments that go along with that, right? So it's
and
first you got to know where it is, and then you have to know what it is and how you've classified it due to its various degrees of sensitivity, right?
sometimes when you know where it is, you've understood where it went. In other words, data loss protection. If you're not after the fact, you want to know where that data is to see if anything happened to it. One of the key points that you mentioned that's good in healthcare. Since I was there, I was a data scientist, and then I moved in to be a CISO. But population health and patient analytics are huge initiatives right now in healthcare, and it brings in money for them from a research side. But the other thing, it requires you taking it out of that EMR and putting it somewhere else.
Yeah.
And it's not always security first, even though people say they do. So, that's an important thing. One of the things that I like to talk about is, in order to reach a certain level of posture, I always tell people you got to have a lot of foundational work. If you look behind me, this house is 187 years old.
Oh,
I
wow.
restored it, but it's built on a good foundation, and that's why it's still here. So I use it as an example often. But what are some of the measurements and metrics that we can derive from data security posture management to let people know if you're good or not good?
Yeah, so I'll kind of start the conversation, and I also be curious, kind of your thought process around it as well, right? So there's certainly the core key ones is being able to attest to your data trust, that you know where it came from, that you know why specifically you're keeping pieces of data, that you're complying with the various regulatory bodies that you're under, that you're keeping only the data that you've had consent on, and that's only being used for that consent, which is another kind of interesting point, because a lot of enforcement is around the consent of data being used for certain
Exactly.
activities, but
Opt in
not
and opt out.
necessarily all activities,
That's
right?
right.
And I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about that here a little bit later in the podcast. But I think that so there's being able to attest to the various compliance regulations that you may have, as well as the various policy procedures, governance around all of that data. Then also, you have your traditional kind of data security metrics of MTR and so on, of being able to resolve, do our threat detection and response, being able to, how fast is it occurring, how long were they in there, all those types of things and metrics as well. What are your thoughts on that?
One of the things too is that, and all those are great because you have to understand, how effective these controls are.
Yeah.
One of the other things I look at is the level of automation in our security program. And we might talk about that from an AI standpoint. I always like it as augmented intelligence and assisted intelligence because Skynet is not yet fully aware. So I'm not artificial intelligence at this time that I know of. But how effectively we use it. One of the things I always try to, we have a lot of tools out there and a lot of cyber tools that give us a lot of information. It's how can we get the information out of it to see one of the areas of data security posture management is the people and the processes. So we have to have a measure of those, and those are how fast do we react, as you mentioned. Are we looking at all the information that comes out of our data? Do we look at false positives, false negatives, true positives? How many events do we have a day? What level of there are there? Do we do any modeling in effective? If you have two critical alerts that come through, but you have 100 medium or lows, you realize that those 100 medium lows add up as a probing attack, and you have to have some artificial intelligence. I always call it actionable intelligence so we can make operational decisions. And
Yeah,
finally,
absolutely, absolutely. Not only that, but to your point, using artificial intelligence to kind of help you narrow down those false positives, to focus really on the 10 things that are important today and where we're vulnerable. But it's not just the artificial intelligence, right? It's the multiple vectors, pieces of information that are coming from different sources and different technologies and so on, so that we can make an understanding of, based on this and this. Individually, those events aren't necessarily bad, right? They can be explained away in a relatively okay term. But when you put those events together, yeah, it actually comes up to a specific attack vector that somebody's trying to exploit.
yep. One of the things that we have discussed is who governs this. So, when you look at enterprise cyber risk management or data security posture management, it's really from an enterprise standpoint. And you have data governance from the data users, maybe your your CIO, your privacy officers. Who do you look at to govern this process from an acceptable use standpoint too?
Yeah, that is a great question because I think it's not necessarily any one person, right? It's not like you can say, go to the CISO and it's his problem, or the CIO. Some cases, at least the people who are leading the effort, it's almost like that. You remember that game you played as a kid, Hot Potato, right? Where you passed
Oh yeah.
around a potato and somebody got it and that they were it, right? It's kind of like that as well. When the CEO has this problem of implementing data security posture management, they're throwing around this hot potato. So it could be the CISO, it could be the CIO, it could be the chief privacy officer, it could be the chief data officer. But reality is they're really just a figurehead, or I would figure, maybe figurehead's a bad word, but they're really just leading the project. But the project team consists of multiple disciplines within the IT and business. So you will have your CISO, you will have your CIO, you will have your privacy and data officers, but you'll actually also have potentially corporate and legal involved as well. You may have your records management and data management people involved as well.
And our favorite outliers are the biomed folks with the medical devices.
And the
We're,
medical
we're
device.
always trying to pull them back into our world. It's an interesting thing when they're the one area that's governed by the FDA.
Yeah.
Um, but these devices now need to be a huge part of your did data security posture management because of the ability for them to be end of life of a $2 million nuclear camera. So you've got to do something about them, and posture management might be watching that vulnerability and monitoring it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's go to some of the next questions. One interesting thing is, we've talked about artificial intelligence, and maybe we dig into that a little more and how this might help. Everybody says it's the biggest thing. Um, One of the areas that I think we really need to get good at, and this is from a proactive AI data security posture management. We'll put that in the parentheses, but it has been slow, as many people don't know, into adoption in healthcare, only because a lot of people to put the brakes on it. A couple places I've been, we had to because no one knew how to govern it.
Hmm.
They didn't know acceptable use cases for it. In other words, who's going to use it, what you're going to use it for, how we're going to agree on it, and govern the data. Because now they're putting, late in the game, they're putting things around it. And the other area is, I told somebody one day, I was at a conference, and they said, well, this will take away the need for doctors and nurses. I said, no. I looked in the future. I watched Star Trek, some of the old 60s episodes, and
Yeah.
there's still doctors and nurses in the future. So we're good. But on that point, how should we look at AI and some of the data security management? Because it's almost like, I've mentioned this to people, we've been here before, right?
Yep.
SaaS, the cloud, AI. So we've been here before, but I think we need to, you know, the same way we do this with those other areas of technology, we might want to add that in with AI, and I'd like to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, look, AI is a great topic to talk about this as well because, and I'm going to offer a perspective here that the way I see it, because like you, having attended a number of IT related healthcare type events here over the years, it's the AI now is like almost every conversation is about AI now. Like for example, I was at HIMSS just earlier this month, or I guess last month now, and I was at HIMSS, and like 99% of the presentations were all about AI. Matter of fact, one of the presenters made a joke and said, "This is one of three presentations at this week-long event that's not AI related, right?" So,
Those were the
so
same
there's
guys
a
that talked about cloud 2 years ago.
yeah, exactly. And so what's interesting though, right, is and again, let me use an analogy, right? And I'll apologize in advance if this offends any football fans out there. And I know that this may be viewed in Europe as well, potentially, but here in American football, we obviously have a lot of passion around that. I would argue that there's a whole lot more passion around college football. And there was a landmark event that happened this last season where
Indiana went 10-0 for a while. My old alma mater. That's a landmark event.
oh,
Virginia
there you go.
University.
So, there was basically a David and Goliath type situation where Vanderbilt, which is very much known as a David, it's a smaller school. It's they usually do okay in their division, but never really excel or do great and fantastic. And Alabama was known as the giant, and they've just had a dominant program for the last 10 plus years or so. And so, everybody expects Alabama to just clean up on Vanderbilt. Well, this last year, Vanderbilt won. And as a result of that, 20,000 plus fans stormed out of the stadium onto the field, destroyed tore off the goalposts. 20,000 people run down to the river to throw the goalposts into the river that runs through their hometown there, Nashville. And so that reminds me of what's going on with AI right now. We've got thousands and thousands of people running down the street, all just yelling, screaming, having no idea what's going on, and throwing stuff into the river, right? For what reason, they don't really know. That's AI to me right now. And so when you look at AI, and particularly around privacy and data security posture management, they're very similar traits, right? I mean, you still have to worry about, how did you collect that sensitive data? Are you using it without consent? Using it without permission? Is it unchecked surveillance? Is it data exfiltration? Is there data leakage happening going on? And
Who has
so
access to it?
yeah, and so when you look, right? So hey, look, recently here there was a very well-known social media platform that we all know. They faced a lot of backlash because their users were notified that they were allowing their data to be able to train AI models that they hadn't necessarily provided consent on, right? And California, in the healthcare space, a surgical patient basically came out and said, "Hey, I found out that my pictures were being used in an AI training model, in an AI data set." He says, "I gave consent for those photos to be taken and used for that procedure. I did not give consent specifically for it to be used in an AI model." So when you look at that, those are some pretty serious privacy breaches. And so I think that with all the hoopla that's going on with AI today, there's not a lot of thinking going on how are we governing these models? How are we ensuring that sensitive data is not getting into these models? How are we ensuring that these models are not leaking out in unintentional data sharing or those type of breaches where we could even potentially use particular prompts to trick the AI model into
One
giving
of
me
the,
sensitive data, right? Even
one
though
of the
that's
things,
what it's not meant for.
one of the protective controls that we can implement is that certain things like ChatGPT, you have your enterprise model, which is here, or everybody can use their personal one. But the ability to control what is on corporate assets, have control and governance over that, so everybody can't use, at least on their corporate assets, um, models and AI tools, OpenAI, ChatGPT that's not within the enterprise, locked within the enterprise, is to make sure you can govern the use of those.
Yeah,
And
and
sometimes,
you ensure that any sensitive data is sanitized or anonymized, potentially in an intelligent way, so you can preserve the value of the data, but not necessarily link it to a specific individual,
and
right?
that involves some training also, because I've can't tell you how many people I've talked to when you look at data security and classification, and they say, well, they took the names off of it, so there you go, it's anomalized.
Yep.
Well, not according to HIPAA. With 18 things of PHI, we've added three more to them, and any three of those that can relate to an area or a procedure that somebody had. So you really can't just take the names off. So it also includes a lot of training for people. One of the things I thought I'd bring into, as we're talking about AI, and you really have to govern it when you look at data security posture and how you're going to manage that. I would say, and maybe if everybody takes this down, this might help. And then Eric, I'd like you to pine on some of these, but we I call these the 5 C's. We got clarity, so we got to develop a really clear, documented risk and compliance policy for AI and especially acceptable use. Collaboration. We got to be able to get people from the radiologists that are using AI as we speak for radiology, oncology, cardiology, but also now they're starting to implement it within certain AI tools. Every vendor has added AI to there. So how do we collaborate with the risk management team, the GRC team, to make sure that we've actually gone through our required vendor risk assessments when any action scope or change in the company has changed? Not a lot of people realize that means that every vendor that tagged AI onto them, it's time for a reassessment, even cursory. But then build controls, build, acceptable, centralized systems at scale. Continuity, we got to implement processes for continuous risk and compliance. So over the years, and that's from the governance. And finally, I tell people it's a cultural thing. Strengthen the security awareness of AI, beat it into them, and say, and mandate certain things. But as we always check that box. We got a policy for it. I'm missing seeing where a policy has stopped everybody from doing something. So actually, we have to figure out how to lock the locks. So in those, that little diatribe there, what are your feelings on that from a governance of AI? Because it is going to be part of this data security posture management.
Yeah, it is, right? And so it actually brings up maybe a larger point, Tim, is the recognition that there's really two sides to this equation, right? There's kind of an advisory side, which you just spoke a lot of, right? Is, why are we doing it? How are we collaborating? How are we communicating? How are we documenting it? How are we understanding our risk posture and so on? Then there's the operational side, right? Is how do we actually implement these things? How do we protect our data and implement those specific controls? How do we control who has access, why, when, where, and making sure that we don't have overlapping privileges, that we don't that folks with privilege access. And if they are an inside actor, which I think I saw a statistic here lately that like 83% of the breaches here recently have been more from an inside use actor or credentials that were compromised. When you look at those types of scenarios, how do you insert the die pack into the bank bag, right? So that if they do exfiltrate data, how do we ensure that that data is no longer good, or at least unusable by that bad actor? How do we actually stop them if they're accessing a database and they're able to get SQL access to it? How do we monitor the behavior to say, wow, this is kind of strange. This is not what Eric normally does. Maybe I should pause what's going on, or perhaps just kill the process altogether, right? So those. While you mentioned a lot of on the advisory side, and I completely agree that those are absolutely important. But then there's the operational side of how do you actually really do this in real life, and how do you implement a data security posture management system, whether it's with a single vendor or combination of multiple vendors that can work together, right?
I agree. That proactive approach, I've always told when I manage security teams as a outside consultant or a CISO, I said, you detect, then they investigate. I'm like, you detect, you block, and you have all the time to investigate it, but you got to block them first and have the ability to do it. And I would say in healthcare, it's triaging. We've stopped the bleeding first. So you also have to have the ability for the people to be able to use those processes effectively. Um, you mentioned something from a IAM and privilege access management standpoint, which is really key to, you know, it's I'd like your thoughts on it because it might not really fall into the data security posture management. However, the people that have access to it will have privilege access. And you get inside people, especially in a health system, that do things against policy, maybe accidentally looked at someone's medical record. I don't have to call the OCR up, but I do have to call that patient. Um, Now you also have people with credential harvest. Um, and people don't track what you mentioned is anomalous behavior activity, which is a very good metric on people that you can now, with large data sets, track those logs so you can get trends. Uh, but then, you actually have to monitor that access. And I wanted to know your thoughts on that being a key part of data security posture management. You
Yeah.
can't do a
So,
lot to it if you don't get somebody's credentials.
yeah, so let's throw yet another acronym out there, right? Data DAG, data access governance, along with identity and identity governance.
In 2 years, somebody's going to take that one from you.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, when you look at those type of activities out there, right? There's a couple different things, right? Having the capability of baselining Eric's life, right? When I log on, how I log on, what I do when I'm logged on, and what applications do I generally use in those type of things. And then, recognizing and baselining that so that at some point in the future, if I deviate from that behavior, that may be potentially a red flag, right? But and then there's a kind of that side of it of understanding a user or entity behavior and being able to understand when that behavior is not normal, right? And being able to flag that to the appropriate people. Other aspects of it, from kind of an operational side of it is, all of a sudden Eric has all these things that he normally does with an application and his daily job of accessing a medical record, for example, to use your point. And now all of a sudden Eric's running a SQL query against, certain columns that are sensitive in nature and doing it in mass and being able to not only recognize that, but being able to take action upon that and say, well, that's not Eric normally, right? So let's either pause it or kill it altogether in doing those things. And then, of course, when you combine that with data access governance of who's accessing what and why, and making sure again that we don't have things like overlapping privileges, that because I changed a role, I don't have something I shouldn't, or because these two types of roles overlap, it gives me something I shouldn't normally have. In addition to managing the privileged access to applications, that seems to be a confluence of things that are coming together. So if I back up one more point, right? So when you look at data security posture management, I think when it first came out in, again, almost 2 years ago now, when it first came out, it did seem to be a little privacy focused because it focused on data discovery and classification capabilities. And so there's a lot of vendors out there that kind of work in that space and produce those type of results, right? But then when the next round of analyst conversations came around, then they began layering in the identity access, the identity governance, purpose-based access. Why am I accessing something? So do I really need a full social security number or a partial social security number? All those conversations started coming into play in the analyst community and what they considered a data security platform or data security posture management platform. Now, here just recently, I've seen at least, or had seen, helped craft a couple different responses to some of the analysts. Now they're laying in threat detection and response, right? And some of those capabilities and user behavior analytics and SOAR capabilities and so on. So, all of a sudden, this data security posture management started off as this little thing, kind of fueled a little bit by privacy regulations and knowledge of what you're doing. And now all of a sudden it's growing and propelling into this much larger beast, if you will. But the beast is actually a good thing because, again, being able to not look at these capabilities individually, but seeing how they can augment other capabilities. Again, just take data and identity, for example, being able to say, I'm Eric. I have a purpose for accessing this data record. Based on that purpose, maybe I should be able to see part or all or none, right? For that specific purpose. So there's identity of data security there. There's entities identity there. There's purpose there as well, and all those type of things. So I think it's an interesting kind of journey that we're on right now, bringing all these things together.
Well, that's an interesting segue into the next question. Our audience might even think we would have questions and answers in front of us, pre-scripted, but this one we don't. So and I had to say that.
Had to say that.
Yeah. So, as you were mentioning that, one of my thoughts is, this has grown. And it's something that wasn't there before. You've also mentioned that it's really pivoted from privacy to maybe the security group. Do you see any different roles, responsibilities, and sometimes, unfortunately, added staff to manage this type of thing? Or does some of this protect in an area so that we can pull those folks from another area? But
I think it actually
everybody is
depends on.
always going to wonder, if we're doing this new process, is it going to take more people?
Yeah, that is it. Yeah, good concept, Tim. I think that I'm going to answer it two ways, right? I think you can actually take both approach. I think both approaches will be taken, right? I think that there certainly will be a framework approach where there might be a senior officer involved in addition to his current title. The two come right to mind are a chief privacy officer or a chief data officer. And then they have a cross-functional set of teams to help implement this framework in different areas, right? I could definitely foresee, though, kind of morphing these CPO and CDO roles into something that is like a chief security posture management role, because it is cross-discipline. It does, as I said earlier with the tube map, it does incorporate multiple stations along various lines until they converge into this concept of DSPM. And so I think that, I could see some consolidation. I think those would be the guys that are further down the maturity curve of how to do this, but the ones that want to start implementing today, it probably will start out as a framework approach under an existing officer, but I think it may morph going down into the future into a consolidated group. Whether it takes more people or not, or just people get shifted, that's kind of a different conversation.
Or the AI Terminator bots will take over from us, and everything will be all good.
Absolutely.
So one of the things, those are all the questions I had. I wanted to, in my closing, and I'll let you make some closing remarks, Eric. But first of all, I see, I hope everybody sees that this is something that's been in the works, but they put it together into almost a management cube in which we can manage our cybersecurity posture. So we have data security posture management. I think we can add into that cybersecurity posture management because it's not just in data security, but then it's the overlay on those things that secure them. And then, as Eric mentioned, then you got the privacy initiatives uh, over all those. So when we put these together, I think we've created a whole new ecosystem of how we can look forward into, a little bit in the future and how we manage data and maybe new roles, responsibilities, skill sets, and always, as we are always trying, is bring everybody in and communicating to them, giving them awareness of what we're doing. So, with that, my name is Tim Swope. I will say real quickly, Lighthouse Cyber Risk Management. I named it a Lighthouse, the company Lighthouse, because my wife and I have another old house next to the second oldest lighthouse in the United States up in Maine. And when you think about what a lighthouse was, in the old days, it was artificial intelligence. They had a Fresnel lens that increased the power of a gas lantern by over 800 times. And that was proactive security to make sure that the people on the boats out there mitigated their risk and didn't crash on the rocks. So that's kind of where all that works together. And I'd like to hear some closing remarks from Eric. And thank you all for listening today.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that story, Tim. Yeah, some closing remarks for me, right? This is kind of an exciting time, I think. When you look at, as I talked about, the convergence, and you look at best of breed type solutions that are out there and making sure you have the right capabilities and if you look at today's world, it really is all about collaboration, right? And leveraging strengths across different disciplines within your IT organization, within your legal counsel, within your data management groups, and so on, and being able to really get a overall view of your security posture. Because again, you look at a lot of breaches that have occurred out there, it's because there's been gaps, and they exploit those gaps and figure out how to get that and exfiltrate the data and so on. So having kind of a coordinated set of capabilities in all these different areas that the analysts are now talking about and espousing, I think is really key and important to make sure, right? Again, so as we protect, as we go down the chain, we're protecting our perimeter, we're protecting our credentials. What happens when the credentials fail? What happens when they get to the data? Are we able to protect the data and put the die pack to destroy the data, like a bank does during a robbery? How do we address all these things? How do we stop the exfiltration as it's happening? How do we respond quickly after that? And so there's a lot of different capabilities and disciplines that are coming together now. So I think it's a very exciting time. From my perspective, here at OpenText, I moved over from the information management governance group about 9 years ago now. So I moved over into the data security group right around GDPR when it started coming out, and I spent a lot of time in the data privacy space, and now the data security space, and now the encryption space, and so on, as well as working with identity and governance and those type of things. So seeing a lot going on, and this seems to be the most exciting time. And so, I encourage you that when you look out on the market, again, I think there's a lot of vendors doing what we all do, which is, we say we do solve world hunger, right? But dig down to the capabilities that you might have out there are needed for a DSPM strategy, and where are those capabilities coming from? How do you solve for those capabilities? Are they do they collaborate and work with each other? Or do you have to patch things together through a best of breed approach as well? So that's kind of my 2 cents is try to get the biggest bang for the buck. Try to have the least exposed surface available for the data breaches, particularly in healthcare, because it is a high value target, and just take care of those things. And so with that, I really enjoyed the time today, Tim. I appreciate
Thank you.
you and the questions, and just excited to see where this all goes.
And one more thing, for all of you listeners, if you want to know solutions, vendors, assistance, help for this, reach out to C Vision. Come to a C Vision conference. I've been going to them for 5, 6 years now. I feel like they're old friends. It's a great knowledge base of people. They have things all over the country, and it is the one place where you can see everybody that is talking that can help you um, implement, um, manage, or kind of get over the hump of what we're talking about today. So I'd suggest you reach out to them, but it's a lot more fun coming to one of their conferences in person. So thank you
Amen.
very much.
Great.
Signing off.